On behalf of the Aspen Institute and the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, welcome and happy Thanksgiving week. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss one of the most talked about topics of the 2020 election year, the Latino vote. I am Domenika Lynch, the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Latinos in Society program. Our mission is to catalyze ideas and solutions that promote the economic advancement of American Latinos. Today's event promises to be an engaging and informative post-election analysis of the 2020 presidential election and the Latino vote. There's no question that 2020 will be a year to remember for the ages, intersecting crises, all occurring in the midst of a pandemic and the most consequential election in a lifetime. More Americans voted in the 2020 election than any other in modern history, with over 65% of eligible voters casting a ballot. And for the first time in our country's history, Latinos, well, we were the largest ethnic minority in the electorate, with 32 million eligible voters, and with record numbers of Latinos turning out the vote, highest numbers of Latinas and Latino youth we've seen in the previous election cycles. Indeed, both President Donald Trump and President-elect Joe Biden benefited from the high turnout of Latino voters across the U.S. Yet the support that they received from this very diverse and complex electorate and why varied in different parts of the country. While nationally the majority of Latinos may lean Democratic, when it comes to state level, there are many different constituencies that cannot be so easily counted on by either party. Today's conversation will highlight how record levels of Latino turnout impacted the outcome of key races and included in this cycle the marquee battleground states. We are thrilled that Maria Elena Salinas, acclaimed journalist and trusted voice in the Latino community, will moderate today's panel of experts. Together, they will explore critical nuances among Latino voters, the issues that we care most about, and which campaign messages resonated with specific Latino constituencies and why. As we transition to a new administration and enter a new year, it is important to focus on the lessons learned and to note that the Latino voice and our vote cannot be taken for granted. It requires an authentic connection and investment. And we want to be forward-looking and really be included in this national agenda as it's being formed. I want to take a moment to give special thanks to our panelists, the UCLA and the Aspen Institute team, and to our sponsors, the Coca-Cola Company and Wells Fargo, for making today's event possible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce a dear friend and one of today's sponsors. Ruben Barales is Senior Vice President for External Relations at Wells Fargo. Before joining Wells Fargo in 2019, Ruben was President and CEO of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. He also led a consortium of organizations focused on training and electing Latino and Latina candidates for public office. Ruben served in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of White House Intergovernmental Affairs for President George W. Bush. Please give a warm welcome to Ruben Barales. Thank you.
Thank you, Domenika. Thank you so much for having us here. So proud that Wells Fargo can be a sponsor for today's session. Looking forward to the information. And as a former Latino elected official myself, it gives me great pride to see more and more Latinos and Latinas being elected to office, which is obviously part of the growing Latino voter population that's increasing. And we're going to hear from our professionals today in terms of what's happening with the Latino vote. Wells Fargo is a leading lender to Hispanic families, home mortgages, small businesses, and we know that Latino economic power is tied to political power in the Latino community. And so we obviously are very interested in what's happening and want to be a part of helping the Latino community as it grows and reaches its goals here in the United States of America. Domenika, I want to congratulate you on your new role at the Aspen Institute at the Latinos and Society program. And I want to recognize Gaddy Vasquez and others who are helping out in that effort as well. And it's an absolute pleasure for me on behalf of Wells Fargo to introduce our moderator this afternoon or morning, wherever you might be. The moderator today has been recognized by the New York Times as the voice of Hispanic America. and you'll probably recognize her as the anchor of Noticiero Univision, disculpa. And she's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. It's my pleasure to introduce Maria Elena Salinas.
Thank you so much, Ruben. That is very kind of you. And hello to everyone. Good afternoon if you're joining us in the East Coast, and good morning if you're joining us in the West Coast. Thank you for joining this very vital discussion as we assess the impact of the Latino vote in the 2020 elections. I recently asked the very respected CEO of NALEO, Arturo Vargas, for a story that I did for CBS on the Latino vote right before the election. I asked him if he thought the sleeping giant would finally wake up, and he answered very bluntly. I hate the reference of the sleeping giant. They haven't been sleeping. What Latinos want is to be engaged in the process, not ignored. So I guess I won't be asking that question again. But for anyone who still believes in that reference, Latinos were wide awake in 2020. They showed up and they made a difference. How they voted and why is a subject we begin to analyze today and will continue to do so for the coming months. So the best way to start this conversation is with some facts. Fact: Joe Biden is the president-elect of the United States, and Kamala Harris is the vice president-elect of the United States. Fact: more Americans voted in 2020 election than in any other election in more than 100 years. Fact: 2020 saw the highest voter turnout for Latinos in history. Another fact: Latino voters made a difference in the outcome of the election in several states. Fact: Latinos are not monolithic. In fact, President Trump made inroads with Latino voters in his bid to win re-election. And now let me introduce our distinguished panelists for you. Mr. Tom Perez, chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He is the first Latino to hold that position. He previously served as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights and Labor Secretary under President Barack Obama. Also joining us is Mr. Mike Madrid, co-founder of the Lincoln Project. He is a former political director for the California State Republican Party and a longtime Republican political strategist with an expertise in Latino voting trends and analysis. Dr. Matt Barreto, a pollster on political campaigns, professor of political science and Chicano studies at UCLA, and co-founder of the research and polling firm Latino Decisions. And Rudy Soto, former candidate for Idaho's 1st congressional district. Mr. Soto received 30% of the vote in his bid to represent his district in Washington. He is of Mexican and Native American descent. Welcome to all of you. Now, I want to remind those of you who are joining us in this conversation that you're welcome to submit your questions for our panelists in the Q&A function below. We will get to your questions in the last 15 minutes. So, Matt, let me start with you. You're the first one. You know, every time I call you with an urgent need to know the latest numbers after an election, you always remind me that it takes time to analyze them. So at this point, what do we know as far as turnout? How many Latinos came out to vote in 2020?
Well, thank you for that, Maria Elena. It's great to be with everyone today, and it's great to be with you. I was especially excited to see your coverage that you mentioned on CBS. It's great to have such a strong Latino voice there on our national news coverage of the Latino electorate. We're still digging through the numbers. That's the short answer. The data has not been certified and publicly reported in every single state. But in many states, it has been, and in many counties, it has been. And the first headline that we take away from this election is one of the facts that you gave us. It was record-breaking Latino turnout. I went back and looked at some historic data, and in 2004, not that long ago, about 7.5 million Latino votes were cast. This year, we're estimating over 16 million. 16 million. It has over doubled the Latino vote in less than 20 years. That cannot be said for the overall American electorate. While this was a big turnout year, the overall turnout did not double from 2004. And the Latino vote over doubled. That trajectory is going to continue. Our population is very young. It is growing in voter registration, and we're going to continue to see that. And so one of the most important takeaways, I think, is that the Latino vote came through in very big numbers. The reports that we were seeing pre-election about early vote increase, that was very, very true. The voter file data we have analyzed on early vote showed maybe as many as 10 million Latino early votes. And then an additional 6 million on election day. So the voter turnout was really historic. And I think that is a testament to just how engaged Latinos were this year. And for me, I think that is the most important finding of this election is that very high number of Latino votes.
Thank you, Matt. This question is for all of you. Was there anything in the outcome of the election that surprised you as it relates to the Latino vote? Tom, let's start with you.
Well, I'm not sure that surprised would be the word, but I was really heartened to go to places like Arizona. I've spent a lot of time in Arizona. I was involved in the litigation 10 years ago involving SB 1070. I was leading the Civil Rights Division when we sued Joe Arpaio. And I bring up SB 1070 because when you look at what happened in Arizona in 2020, you saw, and this builds on Matt's point, dramatic increases in Latino voter turnout. Roughly 650,000 Latinos turned out in Arizona in 2020. And again, just to have a benchmark, you were looking at something like 450,000 in 2016. And again, remember, Joe Biden won by 11 or 12,000 votes in Arizona. And so when I look at the battleground state by battleground state breakdowns, you really see so many battleground states where Latinos made a huge difference. I'll give you one more, and that's Wisconsin, where roughly 100,000 Latinos voted, and we won 71%, 71 to 27. So again, a state where we won by 20,000 votes, the net margin of victory just from Latinos was 44,000. And what was heartening to me was we saw in the Biden campaign, and Matt was an integral part of that. In 2016, we were regularly polling in 3 battleground states. In 2020, we were regularly polling and doing a ton of work in 10 states. And that difference reflects the fact that Latinos, while the denominator varies, they can make a huge difference. Georgia is on our mind because we have an election in January there. And again, Latinos are part of a fusion coalition. There's about 300,000 Latino voters or eligible voters in Georgia. And again, when you look at the margins of victory and you see that the denominators are moving up, that's the most important thing that I think we should talk about is, the percentage of vote that Joe Biden is getting is impressive, but the percentage of a bigger denominator means a bigger margin. And that's, to me, the 1-2 punch that we saw in a number of states. Now, my final point is we still have work to do in places like Miami-Dade County. We didn't do as well there as we'd like to. And, we're analyzing that and we recognize that we have work to do there. Having said that, when I read reports that we lost Florida because of Latino voters in Miami-Dade County, if we had met the benchmark of 2016 of Hillary Clinton or 2012 of Barack Obama, we still would have lost that state by 250,000 votes because of a number of other factors totally unrelated to Latino voters, who, by the way, in Orlando and the Puerto Rican vote there, I think was 70%. So we performed very well elsewhere, but we have to do some more work in Miami-Dade.
We're going to get back to ask you a few questions about what happened in Florida and in Miami-Dade. Mike, I want to move on to you. Tell me what surprised you, if there was anything that surprised you in the outcome of the election as it pertains to the Latino vote.
Yeah, sorry, the audio is a little bit difficult, but I think the question kind of remained the same. But the surprises, though, I think that I saw were really twofold. Two things I think were remarkably different than what we've seen in the past 25, 30-year trajectory. The first is the diversification of the vote. It's just, you can't deny that. Donald Trump did stronger numbers than anybody anticipated. And we've got to recognize that if we're going to be honest about what's happening in the community for a whole host of reasons. So that is surprising. The second, I think most importantly, is that there's regional variations that we have really never seen before. To see Texas, Mexican Americans predominantly in Texas voting decidedly, at least from a Latino perspective, historically, the trend line different than Latinos in, say, Arizona and California, largely because I think of the politicization process that Tom was just talking about. You have these very strong historical markers in places like California and Arizona, which have created essentially a block of voters sitting about a 25, 27% historical standard for GOP support that was exceeded considerably in Texas. I think Florida is a very unique dynamic, again, as Tom was referencing, so I don't think it's an apples to apples comparison. But as we watch the Latino dynamic grow and influence other states that we, part of the fun of this is every 4 years there will be new states that Latino votes are making the difference in these elections. And it's also, I think, in many ways, a typical assimilative pattern as we watch the vote mature into second, third generation voters, which often demonstrate some of the highest propensities. In others, it's a completely unique way to watch America change and changing our contour, our demography, our culture, and of course, then our politics. So we like to say we're not monolithic, but the truth is we have not been. We have been quite monolithic, I think, up until recent election cycles. In 2020, to your point, Maria Elena, was exactly dead on. It's quantifiable now. This is not your grandfather's voting block, right? This is a different dynamic, and I think we're going to continue to see that diversification change the contours of this country and our political landscape for years to come.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Rudy, what is your take on what was new, what was maybe surprising during the 2020 election?
Yes. It's a privilege and pleasure to be on here with all of you. Thank you, Maria. So for me in Idaho, we expected, at least on a personal note, there was a hope and expectation for a blue wave. And when that's happened in the past, a district like mine would have been susceptible to being more competitive. For instance, in 2018, Medicaid expansion passed by over 60%. 16 out of 19 counties in the first congressional district voted in support of it. So when it comes to the kitchen table issues, that resonates with people, and that's what, from where I sit, that's what the Democratic Party is all about. But in rural America and much of suburban America, where Hispanic communities are at the forefront of growth, they're the largest, population that's helping grow rural communities. We're seeing a lot of struggles when it comes to the Democratic Party's message connecting with people, and so I think that was a surprise. But we did have progress. For instance, in Kenny County, where I come from, which is over 20% Hispanic, we had a Hispanic serving higher education institution, the College of Western Idaho. Its board of directors changed over, and it was all minority women and Latinas that got elected. So that's progress, but we definitely have a lot more room for improvement, and especially when it comes to our messaging. And I'll give one last example. I remember going to a lowrider show that was outdoors over the summer and having a young Latino come up and chat with me, and then his dad too, and they wanted to know more about my campaign. And when they learned that I was a Democrat, they said, well, why are you pushing to give everything away for free? And I had to explain that that's not where we're coming from, and that's not what we're about. But in so many of these places, we're getting painted with a broad brush that doesn't represent what we are actually about.
Okay, so probably to most of America, other than Latinos, the one thing that was a surprise is the diversity within our own community, something that we as Latinos already know. What is it that they didn't understand? What do they need to know? And also, we know that diversity even exists within the same party. It's more geographical, and it varies depending on the country of origin. Republican Latino in Florida is not interested in the same issues as the Republican Latino in Texas or in California. And the same thing goes for Democrats. So how do you direct your messaging with that kind of diversity? Who wants to take the answer first?
There are a couple things that we did, Maria Elena, that are directly on point with what you just said. In 2016, our voter file, we didn't have the capacity to do sub-ethnicity modeling. So let me just use a concrete example. If you met a guy named Perez down in Florida and you want him to vote for Joe Biden, or back in 2016 for Hillary Clinton, you know, the most important thing I would argue that you want to know is he Perez de Cuba, Perez de Puerto Rico, Perez de la República Dominicana, de donde es? We didn't have that capacity to do sub-ethnicity modeling. Now we do, because I understood that it's indispensable. Our conversations that we were having with Puerto Rican voters in Florida were very different in many respects from conversations we had with Cuban American voters. And Matt was very involved, and when we were sending mail to voters, we understood that we were sending. You know, there were obviously some overlap. You know, the pandemic has touched everyone across this country, but there are specific issues, and if we don't understand that we are a Latino communities plural, then we'll never be successful. And that's one of the things we did. Very differently in the 2020 cycle. And we had those conversations. Now, in places like Texas, and somebody mentioned Texas, what's really interesting about Texas when you dig in the data is we did remarkably well with Latino voters in the urban areas. You go look at Harris County, off the charts turnout, really good numbers. Now, along the Rio Grande Valley, a different story where we didn't do as well. So when you talk about sub-ethnicity modeling, actually, even within the same ethnicity, sometimes the rural-urban divide is another dimension that we need to understand moving forward. So those are two examples of how we've been doing things differently, and I think that really helped us to connect with voters. But we still know, and somebody in this conversation mentioned the misinformation. That's a big issue, especially in South Florida. The misinformation infrastructure was very, very robust, and it didn't just start in 2018. It has started in 2020. It's been around for many years, and we built our own. But it's a formidable infrastructure to address.
Matt, I know that you are the numbers guy and you were working with the Biden campaign. What did the numbers that you find, well, not the numbers, but the issues that people were interested in, what did you find, how diverse were they? And was the campaign able to address the issues that concern voters in these different locations?
Yeah, I think, building on what Tom just laid out, it is important to try to segment and understand the Latino community, the electorate. We are all Latinos, and we do have many things in common, but we also have diversity in our politics, and that's okay. And I think for a long time, for the better part of the 21st century, campaigns have really had efforts to micro-target and understand different segments of the white vote. Suburban women, non-college educated men, young, sort of hipster Portland types, whatever it is, they have been segmenting the white community. What we did on the Biden campaign was very large sampling and community-driven research and then outreach. It doesn't mean that we still don't have opportunities to grow and do better, but I think we this year turned a big corner in understanding that, having very large samples in Arizona so that we could segment young, US-born, first-time voters as compared to third or fourth generation Latinos in Arizona, Mexican Americans who have been there for 100 years or longer. We took that approach this year. We need to keep doing that. We need to keep understanding those differences within the Latino community so that we can more effectively communicate with someone who still considers themselves Latino, but is maybe third or fourth generation and has a different sort of view than someone whose family has only been here 25 years, and that's it. So I want to encourage everyone to keep that up. And when you do that, you will understand that, yes, there still is commonality, even between Cubans, Venezuelans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans. There are things that bind us together, but our politics are unique. And our politics, at the end of the day, and this gets to your opening statement from Arturo, I could almost hear him saying those exact words to you. Latinos want to be engaged. They want to be engaged as Latinos, but also as Americans. And when you do that, you will make inroads. And so I think that the Biden campaign was on the right track. I think it will continue going in that direction. But there are other groups, like the group that, Mike participated in, that was perhaps, targeting Latinos that maybe considered themselves a little bit more centrist or conservative. And we need to continue those outreach efforts from both parties. We need to talk to those folks and understand what makes them tick and how we can bring them and make them feel engaged in our system.
Mike, I want to ask you about the Lincoln Project, but before we get to the Lincoln Project, I want to follow up on what we just heard as far as the messaging is concerned. It seems like not only in Florida and in some parts of Texas, but probably all across the board, there were some inroads that President Trump made with Latinos, even if it's 1%, 2%, but there were inroads across the board in the U.S. Now, I know that you weren't supporting President Trump, but what was it about his campaign, his message, his persona? What was it that resonated with voters?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And I think it's a good segue from what Matt just articulated. And I think he articulated it very well. What he's doing and what he's leading the forefront on here is segmenting the Latino vote in a way that has never been looked at before. And that's very important when he's talking about these oversamplings with key demographics. You're finding not just there's variations, but what is driving that politicization? What's driving the political decisions? That's going to have to be done on campaigns going forward. That's no longer going to be something that you might have been the luxury of a campaign in the past. The Latino vote is getting so big and so diverse now. These segments and segmentation is going to be very important, which takes me, I think, to the answer. What we identified as this kind of Trumpy sort of vote tended to be a U.S.-born Hispanic Mexicano, largely 40 and under. U.S.-born Hispanic male under 40. Now, the reason why we called them a little bit Trumpy was because they were responding to a lot of the same messaging that white non-college educated males were responding to. And again, it's a really fascinating look at what, by the way, our women, Latinos were not, okay? Latinos were like, we're not having any of this nonsense, but men were kind of leaning a little bit there. The good news is they weren't what we called sticky. We could move them back with some messaging, especially a more cultural message, but there was some economic messaging that for whatever reason was compelling them to vote and develop these attitudes that were not terribly dissimilar from white non-college voters, the kind of the core of the Trump base. And so there's two ways you can look at this. One is you can say, well, should we be surprised by that? US-born Hispanic males don't have college degrees, experiencing some of the same economic concerns that their white cohorts are, maybe consuming the same media, they're behaving the same way, right? The other is, and that's a very strong economic appeal, incidentally, and that's a very important part. Not that I would suggest that Donald Trump's economic messages were going to be solving anything, or even trying to, but there was something that was compelling them. And then that leads to the other question, which is how much are these cultural indicators that we have historically been using to drive turnout in the Latino community, often quite successfully? Is there a limit to that? Do we need to now expand into not just looking at a get out the vote model and talking about those issues that we so strongly associate with Latino politicization, but now broaden it to this economic messaging, which is where I think ultimately the definitive element of where Latino politicization and political attitudes will be determined. So succinctly, I believe that the majority party in the next 20 years will be the one that captures the economic aspirations of a multicultural middle class. I think the Republican Party has a significant problem with that because they're not interested in a multicultural anything. The Democratic Party, I think, needs to really refine some of these economic messages. They're certainly way ahead of where the Republicans are, but there's only so much leakage you can prevent. As the Latino community gets bigger, it's going to diversify. So you have to be mindful that maybe Democrats, slips 2 or 3 points, but in the raw vote, it's growing so fast that you're not really losing anything. I think the more appropriate way to look at it is say Republicans are losing the second fastest, largest segment of the electorate by 75-25, 70-30, and that's the death knell. It's just a demographic death knell.
Okay, so another question for you. You co-founded the Lincoln Project. Can you describe it and explain what the objective was for those who still don't know about the Lincoln Project?
Yeah, briefly, the Lincoln Project was a group of 8 Republican current and former political consultants who recognized literally a year ago this month that the Republican establishment had basically failed, we believe, the country and in defending and protecting the Constitution of the United States. It had become so complicit in such a cult of personality behind what we view as really a demagogic threat, the rise of authoritarianism in this country. And so we decided that we would do what we do best, which is run campaigns. This started, as you probably are aware, right before the impeachment began, right before almost every Republican U.S. senator didn't hold up to their constitutional oath in protecting this country by not even wanting to see evidence of the malfeasance of the President of the United States. So our objective was to bring the best talents that we had, build an operation to make sure that Donald Trump was not elected and that he would be defeated to the Democratic nominee, whoever that was. Obviously, it was Joe Biden, and we're honored to be part of a coalition that was successful in that effort.
So just to be clear, you opposed President Trump, but not necessarily Republican candidates.
Well, no, we were very aggressively opposed to most of the Senate candidates. I think the only candidate that we would suggest that we were supportive of would be Mitt Romney, based on constitutional principles. This really is not an ideological organization. We view the Republican Party as a threat to the American experiment. We view the Republican Party at this moment as a threat to the underpinnings of democracy, and we believe that all of those Republican senators and the President of the United States were complicit in undermining the foundations of our government.
To the point where you would be willing to leave the Republican Party?
Well, I haven't left yet. I'm going to make them kick me out, or drag me out screaming, but I'm going to go down with a fight because I want to hold up a mirror and show them that they're not who they claim to be. And I think that I can be most effective fighting this threat from this front. I don't believe that the threat has gone away, by the way. I think the Republican Party will continue to devolve into a really malicious form of white identity grievance politics. And I think it's going to be around for another couple of decades.
Well, I'd like to note that the Aspen Institute and UCLA have invited several Republicans to join this conversation, and they either refused to or were not available. But we did send out several invitations, and that is why they are not joining us in this conversation, because none of them were either available or accepted the invitation. Let me go to you now, Rudy, because I know that you're a Democrat running in a red state. So, and you got 30% of the vote, which is pretty good. You were in second place. How does a young Latino Democrat run in a state like that? What kind of messaging do you have? And do you expect to get support from white voters and maybe even conservative voters? You're on mute, I think.
There we go. Absolutely, without a doubt. I was born and raised in Nampa. There are so many parts of my background that are diverse. Being a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes of Idaho, I'm a veteran. I grew up in public housing, overcame a lot of challenges. But more importantly, I was running to stand up for people from all walks of life who struggle with access to affordable health care, like my dad, who had lost his factory job in 2014, got laid off, lost his insurance. Shortly thereafter, got sick, had cancer, couldn't get treatment in time, and passed away. And so those are the types of issues that I was pushing to the forefront that, really resonated with people from all walks of life. And so, when it comes to people needing to stand up for folks from rural communities, reservation communities, that's the message that I brought to bear, and it was received very well. I received the endorsement of the Idaho's largest paper, the Idaho Statesman, lots of elected officials, locally throughout the state. And it was a very positive thing. And I think it's important for people from places like where I come from to see that, minorities, Hispanics, Latinos, you name it, run for office at any and all levels to normalize it. Because with us being, a size, for a lot of people that don't know, I mean, the county that I come from, Canyon County, is the second most populous in the state. But we still have a lot of challenges when it comes to even just voting rights, voter suppression. I was very much at the forefront of fighting that while also running the campaign, because we went from having 55 polling locations to 5. And then I sounded the alarm on it, joined up with Senate candidate Paulette Jordan, and we changed that and got it restored to 21 polling locations. Just as recently as 2018 in Canyon County, there was an English-only rule so that there could be no assistance for Spanish-speaking community members, which make up 40% of the Hispanic community there in Idaho. So we have a lot of room for growth and for progress, and it takes getting started. And I'll mention just one other thing. Throughout the course of my campaign, I met incredible young people from all walks of life. But I remember one in particular, Tomas, who is a National Guardsman. He's like 19 or 20 years old. He's about to become a sheriff, and he was in a mariachi band that came out to help me with a get out the vote event. And he's just a really incredible young man who I very much admire. And so I think by him seeing me being a candidate as a young age, 35, perhaps he'll aspire to run for student government and get an early start and see that he could get involved in his community and shoot for the moon.
Right.
For the stars, and then land on the moon.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. I want to go back to Florida because really, we can't ignore the elephant in the room. It seems like the narrative on the Latino vote has revolved around Florida, in particular Miami-Dade County. Although Joe Biden won the county, President Trump improved his margin from 2016 by 22 percentage points. So, that is a lot. Tom, I know that you mentioned it before, and I know that you like to look at the glass half full and not half empty. But, I live in Miami. And I can tell you that I saw the ads day in and day out. I saw the misinformation. I felt the misinformation really be ingrained in the minds of voters here, not only Cuban American voters, but then you have to include Venezuelans and
critical mass of Dominicans. Yo soy Dominicano, and I had to say that. And so when you disaggregate this, we underperformed with Cuban American and Venezuelan American voters in Miami-Dade County. There's no doubt about that. That is a fact. And part of that was, I think a big part of this was we need to have a much more robust counter misinformation infrastructure. We have this at the DNC. We have people who do nothing but this. And, we get weekly reports of Spanish language misinformation campaigns. It's important to understand that these campaigns began, Rick Scott was doing stuff. This has been a machine that has been in place for many, many years. The socialism attack is not new. When Social Security was introduced in the 1930s, Republican opponents said that was socialism. Medicare and Medicaid, there were Republican opponents who said, including Ronald Reagan in the 60s, Medicare will lead to socialism in America. So this is not a new attack. What we saw in Miami-Dade County is it was a relentless attack. And in the end of the day, I think it had some traction. But at the same time, let me again move back. Now, I said 30% of the electorate is the Latino electorate is Puerto Rican. And we got, you go up to the I-4 corridor and we had roughly 70%, and Matt can confirm my numbers, roughly 70% of the Puerto Rican vote in Miami, in those areas, especially the I-4 corridor, where we have critical mass of Puerto Rican voters. So, I mean, for me, lesson learned there is we have to be vigilant about countering the misinformation. And one thing that we are going to have going for us is Joe Biden in the White House. When Joe Biden grants temporary protected status to Venezuelans in Florida, he will, in one stroke, in one day, have done more for Venezuelans than Donald Trump did in 4 years. Because Donald Trump was a lot of bluster when it came to Venezuela, and he was no action. And they will see. And so when you look at how presidents tend to do with Latino voters, and go back to George W. Bush and go back to Barack Obama, George W. Bush did better with Latino voters in 2004 than in 2000. Barack Obama did better with Latino voters in 2012 than he did in 2008. Why? Because they had 4-year track record to see that all of those attacks were bogus attacks. And they saw that he delivered for them. And to get to Mike's point, delivered for them on core economic issues, delivered for them on not just immigration related issues, but healthcare and those basic bread and butter issues. Latinos want to feed their family. They want security. They want a president who's going to deal with this pandemic. And we saw that in our polling across the board. So yes, we have more work to do down in Miami-Dade County because we underperform there. But again, I think it's really important to understand the broader picture in Florida, where we did actually quite well, and what we have to do to stem the tide. And I think governance is going to help us a lot, because when people see Joe Biden and know what he's doing for them, whether it's immigration reform, whether it's fixing the pandemic, whether it's lowering the unemployment rate. We have double-digit unemployment with Latinos. It was 5.9% when Barack Obama and Joe Biden left office. It's now in double digits for Latinos. When Joe Biden fixes that problem, I think you're going to see support in Miami-Dade and elsewhere grow.
Well, just to be fair, yes, the unemployment is higher, but we are in the middle of pandemic, and those jobs, many of those jobs were lost because of the pandemic. So we have to be fair on that side. Mike, I'd like you to address more or less the same issue when it comes to Florida. I mean, you're a Republican, you're Mexican American, you're not Cuban, but the Republican Party always said that their ground game was better than the Democrats' ground game, that they campaigned during 4 years, not in the last 2 or 3 months. Do you feel that Republicans are doing a better job in trying to seduce, for lack of a better word, Latino voters to their ranks?
No, no. Republicans have been saying this for 30 years, and I know because I've been there. No, they're not. Look, and as a practitioner, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer the Florida question, but there is validity to what is being said here. And look, I don't believe that you should contest every vote. I don't think that's how you win elections. I think when we were polling and looking at Florida and looking at Latino vote in Florida, we were seeing the same over-consolidation in Miami-Dade. We were seeing a multi-generational Cuban voting bloc. We looked at the spend. I think that's the one county that the Trump campaign spent more money than anywhere else in the country. So it was working. The question is, how much do you need to contest that? And it was clear to us that the Biden campaign was focusing efforts in the I-4 corridor to turn out the Puerto Rican vote and these other constituencies. It's exactly the way we would have approached the campaign. So you can't win every vote. And again, as we're learning about the diversity in the Latino community that we've all seen and talked and written about extensively, and now that we're seeing it happening on the ground, there are going to have to be determinations about how this vote is going to be secured. I think the days of one party getting 80% of the vote, 75% of the vote are probably gone. That's okay. I think that's actually healthy for democracy, as long as there's a competition for these votes, and hopefully a movement away from what the Republican Party has been doing, which is kind of using the changing demographics as kind of a racial punching bag, and Latinos have been at the front and center of that. But to suggest that somehow the Republicans are doing a better job in the ground game in Latino communities is absolutely incorrect.
Matt, can you address that? I know that you have been out there quite a bit doing polling for the Biden campaign. Do you think that that's an erroneous perception that Republicans have actually been working on the ground in a more direct way with Latino voters than Democrats have?
I do think that the Miami-Dade electorate is unique. So let's put that into perspective. And it represents a very unique area in which there is a long legacy of Latino Republicans elected to almost every level of government. So there is an infrastructure, and there has been for 30 years in Miami, of Latino Republican leadership, even ideologically diverse within the infrastructure there. There are more centrist and even left-leaning who are Republicans, because that was the party in power, and that was Latino driven. So it has been there for a very long time. And I think what has happened is that the misinformation campaign in 2020, I think, is really a powerful story about what happened in Miami-Dade. That is, it is the case that folks like Senator Rubio started working on that misinformation. You saw he was tweeting just today additional wild theories about how some of these appointees are going to ruin America and are socialists. They have been working on that line in a otherwise Republican-leaning constituency for a very long time. And the Democrats were aware of it. As Tom said, you know, the DNC had an entire disinformation campaign. We would get daily updates from Tom's team on the campaign of what was happening in Spanish language YouTube channels in Miami. So I think what the Democrats can do is recognize that, and they need to get in there at that level. And instead of thinking that we're only going to convince people with these great arguments, which I do think worked in most of the country, but they didn't appear to work in Miami, we need to go in and we need to penetrate more deeply and have conversations to dispel those myths about socialism and changing America. Because it is the case, and it didn't just happen overnight. You know, that, as I said, it has been there for 30 years in Miami-Dade. And I think that it is something to look at. But remember, it only represents 3%. That's 3% of the Latino electorate nationally is in Miami-Dade. And there's so much more across the country. And so while I think it's an interesting community to dissect, it is not representative of what happened in 2020.
Right, but it is the one that's making headlines. It is the one that across the country and maybe even, you know, across the world is the one that is really creating.
Well,
that,
I think
is driving
part of it.
Attention.
Part of it, I think, is a happenstance of time zones. Okay, and so if you can imagine, if we could all imagine a different election scenario on election night, where Arizona was the first state to close, and we saw these huge margins and these huge growth numbers, as Tom mentioned earlier, probably 650,000 Latino voters in Arizona this year, 100 or 150,000 increase, and huge margins for Biden-Harris in Pima County, in Maricopa County. What if that had been the first piece of information we all had on election night? And Miami didn't report any data. They were like Philadelphia. They were waiting and counting ballots. Everyone would have been talking about how the Mexican-American community came out and delivered and flipped Arizona. Remember, Arizona was the first state to flip. It was one of the last states to certify and finalize, but it was the first state to show Biden had reversed the Trump 16. And so the reason it's getting this attention is that we were all nervous collectively on election night, and Miami came in first, and we got obsessed over it. Not me, because I had been telling people, you know, and seeing the same data Mike had seen, we're probably underperforming historically. We're on track, but we're dropping off from this election. So I want to put that in perspective. It's 3% of the electorate. There is work to be done there, but we should be talking about Arizona. We should be talking about the Latino vote in Philadelphia, which came out in huge numbers, and including the Latino vote in Georgia, which hit 185,000. That's record breaking. And there's more work to be done there. We should be investing in Latinos and discussing the Latino vote in Georgia. And I know that there's lots of important media stations and personalities in Miami, but it is only 3% of the national Latino vote.
In Arizona, of course, it's a phenomenon. Arizona has been working for 10 years toward this moment where they would turn it blue. Of course, because of SB 1070, it's sort of like got people more engaged, got Latino voters more engaged. There's several organizations like Voto Latina, Mi Familia Vota, and a lot of others that have really been working the streets trying to make sure that they register voters and that they get them out to vote. And it worked this time around. But this takes me to my next question. During all the years I covered elections while I was at Univision, what we would hear from voters is that one of the things that kept them away from the voting booth is not having a good choice. Many felt that one party was hostile to them and that the other one was taking them for granted. So, Tom, does the Democratic Party take Latino voters for granted? Because that is a perception out there that they show up only 2 months before an election.
Well, absolutely not. And that's why, we started, I mentioned our sub-ethnicity modeling. When I got to the DNC in 2017, we had a lot of work to do. We had to rebuild our infrastructure and rebuild trust. And part of the infrastructure rebuild, not sexy, but indispensable as it relates to connecting with Latino voters, is developing the capacity to talk to Venezuelans differently from Colombians, differently from Cubanos and Puerto Ricanos, and having developed that capacity, then to use it. And that's exactly what we did, not only in Florida, but elsewhere. You look at what we were able to do in the 2018 cycle, and we made tremendous progress. You saw Latino voter turnout in the midterm election was actually you had a higher percentage of Latinos that voted in Arizona in 18 than in 16. That's nuts. That's remarkable. And, I've been in Arizona for 10 years, starting with Arpaio and SB 1070. And so we understood not just in Florida, and we tend to think of Latinos and we think of Arizona and Florida and Colorado and New Mexico. Latinos are difference makers across the country. Look at Nevada, look at Arizona, look at Wisconsin. I mentioned that before, a 44,000 vote margin of victory for Latinos in Wisconsin. And we understood, we lost Wisconsin by 22,000 votes or 21,000 votes in 2016. We knew that Latinos could be the difference maker. We had a 40,000 vote swing in Wisconsin in 2020. Same deal in Michigan, another state that we would talk about more if Joe Biden had actually won. He came close, but North Carolina, you saw a dramatic increase in Latino voter turnout, and you see the Latino population is exploding. And so I recognized that immediately into my tenure. And that's why we made these early investments, not only in talking to Latino voters, but also fielding and supporting Latino candidates down ballot. And we've seen tremendous progress in that area. Is there more to do? It's a timeless journey. Of course there is. But we are far better off now than we were 4 years ago. All politics is personal. You can't show up every 4th October at someone's church and call that organizing. That's transactional politics. And the reason why we won in 17, 18, 19, and then the biggest prize of all again in 2020 is because we built these relationships and we have delivered on promises. People see the contrast between what Joe Biden and other Democrats are fighting for. And I applaud Mike and the work that they've done at the Lincoln Project, because this is really about our character as a nation. The party of Lincoln is dead. And the party of Trump is a very dangerous party. I wish the party of Lincoln were not dead. I think we thrive in a two-party democracy where both parties are operating within guardrails. Latino voters have seen that these guardrails have been obliterated by a president who, when he went down the escalator of the Trump Tower 5 years ago, he started right away attacking our communities. And that is why I think we have a real opportunity here, and we saw it come to roost in Arizona, and we're seeing it elsewhere, but we need to sustain it. And that's exactly what we're going to continue to do. Build on this success, continue to climb the mountain in Texas. We made progress in certain parts of the state, remarkable progress. Texas, I am certain, is going to be a real battleground state in 2024. And here's the reason, one word: Latinos.
Thank you, Tom. Mike, before I go to my questions, I already have some questions from our audience. Mike, as a Republican, is this the Republican Party of Donald Trump?
Yeah, unfortunately it is. I'm not very optimistic about the Republican Party returning to a classical conservatism that I joined for. I became a Republican because I was concerned about economic issues in the Latino community, and I wasn't seeing that voice being addressed, and I think it's desperately needed, perhaps now more than ever. But this is very much a party that is driven by white identity and white grievance exclusively. Now, there's the economic moorings, the foreign policy moorings, the character moorings, the morality moorings, everything that Republicans claims to be for decades has shown to either be a facade or people are complicit and okay with somebody who is a charlatan advocating for it. So, but it is very much, it speaks very much to identity. And this is the great irony of all of this, is the Republican Party has always chastised the Democrats for being the party of identity politics. Well, the greatest purveyor of identity politics is the Republican Party. It's just white identity, so they don't recognize it as such. But that's exactly what's going on. Is places like California, the Republican Party is 85% white in a state that is 35% white. I mean, this is not hard to do the correlation to see what's happening here. It's not hard to see that the issues matrix that Republicans talk about are obviously very strongly fused with whites who feel economic collapse or feel a loss of stature, blaming other people for what they believe is the demise of America. So that trend's not going to end. In fact, I think that the loss of Trump in this campaign, the demise of the Trump administration, is perhaps only the end of the beginning, as Churchill said. We think we've got a 20-year demographic fights to make sure that this element, and it is a social problem, doesn't destroy our democratic institutions, because I think that is one of its aims.
We're going to go to our first question from the audience. The question is, we know that there was a significant increase in participation amongst young Gen Z Latino voters. Naleo Education Fund estimates that there were 330% increase in early voting turnout amongst this segment. What is the story here? How do we speak to them and as the future of the country and as traditionally a more progressive segment of the Latino vote? I'm going to start with you, Rudy, and then Matt.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's reaching them where they're at, reaching them through the mediums that they use, social media, TikTok, all the platforms that they engage in, and through the things that they like. And so I think that's the most effective way. Partnerships with, influencers from all segments of society, whether it be athletes, celebrities, journalists, elected officials, you name it, the whole gamut. That's what I believe.
Matt, I'm going to ask you the next question instead of answering that same one. What can the early results from 2020 tell us about how to approach the Latino vote in 2024 and 2028 and so on? And I would add too.
Yeah, I think, let's pick up from the previous question and Rudy's comment. That is, the Latino electorate is by far the youngest. It will continue to get younger as more young people age into the electorate. So one statistic I used a lot during the campaign in Arizona was that there were 150,000 Latino high school students in 2016 in the Clinton-Trump election, US born, eligible to vote. Guess what? In this year, in 2020, they were all eligible to vote. They were 18, 19, 20, 21. We have the same thing happening. There's another 175,000 Latino high school students this year who just barely missed being able to vote in this presidential, who will be eligible. So the youth in our community is transforming our electorate. And so we need to reach out to them, get them engaged, let them feel heard, and massively target voter registration campaigns. So groups like Voto Latino, Mi Familia Vota, other groups that are targeting voter registration, the Voter Participation Center, these groups need to be encouraged to go after young Latinos and bring them in, because our community is going to continue growing. You heard Tom say earlier about the huge increase in the denominator, meaning the number of Latino voters. I mentioned that it has over doubled in 16 years. that trajectory is going to continue. And so people need to be looking at the Latino vote as a young vote, as a bicultural vote, a vote that many of these young folks are US born, but they have immigrant parents. And so engaging them in English, but through a Latino lens, talking to them about their issues as Americans. I think that's the best thing that we can do, is focus on the youth, and that will help us grow the Latino vote for the next few election cycles.
Thank you. The next question is for Mike. What is your vision for an ideal Republican Party, and how does this vision include Latinos?
I'm not sure that I really have much of a vision for a Republican Party anymore. I'm not convinced, like I said, that it's one salvageable. But I'm also, with all due respect to Tom, I'm not really interested in party politics generally. I've worked for good Democrats who have advocated for the Latino community. I've worked for good Republicans who've advocated for the community. I'm more interested in advocating for my community, regardless of party. I certainly have a belief system that I adhere to. I'm just not convinced that the party structure that we have right now with both parties is working for the best interests of the community that I love. So,
thank you. Tom, this question is for you. How do you explain the losses in the House?
Could you repeat your question?
How do you explain the losses in the House?
Sure. Yeah. If you look at what happened in the cycle after wave elections, and we can go 2010, for instance, Republicans won, I think, 60 seats or something like that, took over the House. What happened in 2012 was they lost a number of those seats. Why? Because they won a number of seats in Democratic districts, and then you have a presidential cycle, and you end up having greater turnout, and they lost some of those seats. You look at the Kendra Horn, a wonderful member of Congress from Oklahoma. She won in 2018 in a Trump plus 14 or 15 district. Xochitl Torres Small, wonderful member in New Mexico. Her district was, again, Trump plus double digits. The list goes on. There were 7 or 8 people like that who didn't pull it out in this election cycle, where you had greater turnout from the fact that we were in a presidential cycle. So that is to be expected in the year after a wave election. We had a wave election in 2018 in the House. So I'm continuing. I look at where we are now and where we were 4 years ago when I got to the DNC. We didn't have the House of Representatives, and we now have it under Speaker Pelosi's leadership. Yes, we have a smaller margin. Yes, I would like to have won some of those seats in Texas that were really close races. And what we saw was, some of the turnout modeling that we had turned out not to be accurate. And so we lost a lot of close races there. But I look at history, and, I frankly expected that we were going to end up in the net negative in terms of numbers of seats, because we had done so well. Another explanation is we've got to, in 2010, the Republicans, they wiped us out in a lot of state elections for governors, state houses. And so they were in charge of redistricting. So we have so many states where we not only have to win, we got to beat the spread in order to win our races, because of the gerrymandering that, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has sanctioned. And that's another factor. And that's why I'm glad we have 8 more legislative chambers that have flipped, and we have 24 governors now instead of 15 governors. That's going to help us now as we get into the next redistricting cycle to draw fairer maps. When we draw fairer maps, we do pretty well. Look at Pennsylvania. We had a fair map in 2018. Finally, we went from 5 out of 18 to 9 out of 18. And on a certain level, it makes sense. Pennsylvania is a swing state. You ought to have 9 or 9-9 or 10-8. That's where it ought to be. But because of gerrymandering, it wasn't. So that's a continuing challenge, because Wisconsin is still gerrymandered. Other states in the same boat.
Well, we have time for one more question, and I want to address it to Matt so that we can wrap it up. Matt, I know that you're a specialist in the Latino vote. That's what you do with Latino decisions. Given the diversity that we've talked about today, can we say that there is a Latino vote?
Well, I think I've been getting that question a lot, and it's a very important question. I do think there are Latino voters. And as I said in the opening, I still think there's a lot that we have in common with each other, whether it's Cubans and Venezuelans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Central Americans here in California. We do have a lot in common. But what we have learned this cycle is that you need to also understand our diversity and to segment us. And everyone wants to feel included and engaged. And if you look at the areas where candidates, and in particular the Biden campaign, focused heavily, you saw that return of investment. You saw very high performance in some of these specific battleground states. So we can still talk about Latino voters, but we should not talk about the Latino vote because it is so many different segments and it is so diverse. But all of us within that segments, within that diversity, we still identify as Latinos, and we do see something in common with other Latinos. But as I said, we do have that political diversity. So let's continue to remember that. Let's move forward with outreach to Latinos as though they're not all the same. And I think that will be the most successful strategy for political organizing.
Right. I'm sure there's a lot of lessons learned that can be applied going forward. And I want to thank you. We're out of time. I know that we can continue to have this conversation for hours, but we're now out of time. So Mr. Tom Perez, Mike Madrid, Dr. Matt Barreto, Rudy Soto, thank you so much to all of you for joining us, for your insight, for your intellect, and for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you to UCLA and the Aspen Institute for inviting me to moderate this panel. And now I would like to pass it on to Sonja Diaz, founding director of UCLA's Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. Again, thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maria Elena. Today's conversation really demonstrated that for those that are looking to understand the Latino vote, it's important to go straight to the experts. And this robust and dynamic conversation about something many of us have been saying for a long time is simple. There's no path to the White House without the Latino electorate. There's many lessons from 2020. We heard all about them, but these lessons should not fade with the news cycle. One need only look to Georgia and the role of a Black and brown coalition in ensuring that they can overcome voter suppression to cast a ballot. Now, Latinos aren't a monolith, and we know that engagement must be done early and automatically. They're not a single issue community. And with that, they want to shape our future economy. They want to decide about issues around global warming. They want access to quality healthcare. And most importantly, they want to get over COVID-19, which has decimated Black and brown communities. In order to do this, Latinos, like other voters of color, cannot be taken for granted by either party, candidates, or campaigns. And we know, and our research at UCLA has made clear in 2018 and in 2020, that the campaigns that inspire Latino turnout will be rewarded with winning margins that have the power to swing outcomes, like we saw this November. Now, there are states like Arizona and Georgia that provide a roadmap for the future. We know that it's community organizers and advocates and young Latinos, along with Black and Indigenous voters, who really are the smart investment. And these folks are eager. They're eager to transform policy around issues like guns, police abuse, and climate change. And so policy necessitates representation. And yesterday, we got news of the nomination of Alex Majorca to lead the Department of Homeland Security, the first Latino to have that job. We hope that he is one of many Black and brown and Indigenous leaders who will play critical roles in the new Biden administration. Their voices and their lenses are essential, not only for the immediate challenges that lie ahead, the ones that just seem to come and introduce themselves in the science fiction of 2020, but they're necessary to get this pandemic under control. And this pandemic has put so many of our families and our households in an economically precarious situation that requires urgent action. So today's conversation made this point clear, and let me reiterate it. There's no American agenda without a Latino agenda. And the future of prosperity of this country and our ability to recover, to continue to be resilient, needs to center on the essential and frontline communities that will drive the growth in our economy, but also will continue to transform electoral outcomes. There's no going back to whatever normal there was before January 2020. And Latinos are ready and eager to be an integral part of a stronger, better America. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce our musical performance, Amados. And I want to say, be safe, everybody, and thank you all for supporting Aspen and UCLA for this critical event.
Okay. Now we got kind of a little bit. Ready? 1, 2, 3, bam.
Se ha dicho que este mundo tiene mucho que ofrecer. Tú esperando a alguien que te quiera complacer. Amor vendrá, tiempo habrá. No pierdas toda una vida sin poderla disfrutar. Que cuando digo tienes dentro de ti todo lo que se necesita para vivir. Deja muy lejos los viejos consejos que por alguien no hay que rendir. Busca nuestro destino. Nos llenará la vida de pasión. Nunca olvides por quién vives. Eres todo un tesoro. Cuando entiendes lo que eres, no te hace falta amor. No pierdas interés en lo que realmente quieres, pero no olvides a tu prójimo amar. Que cuando digo tienes dentro de ti todo lo que se necesita para vivir. Sola camino, pero siempre recordando que la dueña de mi vida seré yo. Busca nuestro destino. Nos llenará la vida de pasión. Nunca olvides por quién vives. Eres todo un tesoro. Cuando entiendes lo que eres, no te hace falta ver superar lo que quieras. Fuerzas no te faltarán. Eres todo un tesoro. Una gema como tú no hay.
Did it work?
Hopefully you weren't muted this entire time.